David White, you're a partner at the retail practice for Deloitte, and you've been part of a global report into retail around the world. What are some of the key findings you found about Australia and about the international impact of competition in Australia?
Well, our report looks at the top 250 retailers globally, and within that report we've got 2 Australian entrants. We've got Woolworths and Wesfarmers both sitting at 18th and 22nd respectively, so still in the top 25 and still obviously highly competitive. But what we're seeing is the increased globalisation and competition in the Australian market. So of the top 250, we've got 37 competing in Australia. There was 30 last year. So we're seeing this continued influx of the big players, the big global retailers into Australia, which is increasing competition and obviously has real challenges for some of our local retailers.
Now let's split it apart. So we'll go with say fashion first. So the likes of H&M and Zara, what impact does that have on local retailers like a Myer or David Jones, for instance?
Well, obviously there's the market share issue, but also just in terms of pricing. Those 2 brands that you mentioned, huge brand appeal. What they've done is really look to set themselves up in the CBD, so that's really put a lot of pressure on property prices as well, and really created a buzz and got people into their stores as opposed to some other sort of more established Australian retailers. So that's had a real impact just in terms of the sheer number of people visiting their stores.
And is there a clear impact in terms of other brands having to cut their prices to match them?
There's definitely put pressure on price, but some of the brands that have come in, so the ones that you mentioned in particular, they still manage to compete at a pretty reasonable price margin, and it's really around the Australian consumer wanting those brands and really previously not being able to get access to them. So that's been a real challenge, not just a question of price.
Now that price question is a huge one, and a lot of Australian consumers are worried about it. I'll take, for example, the suit that I'm wearing right now. It's a J. Crew suit I bought in the US for $1,000, but it's probably about twice as much for a similar suit here. And a lot of Australians are saying, well, how come I'm paying so much more here in Australia than elsewhere in the world? If these international retailers are available, why aren't we getting the cheaper prices?
Well, look, there are price differences across all different countries, and Australia is no exception. Whilst it is possible to set different prices in different countries, that will always be the case. But as we're seeing the rise of online, also third-party suppliers of different brands, that's really challenging that model. So yes, there are differences at the moment, but we do expect those to sort of start to come down, continue over time.
Now, what about in the supermarket sector? Coles and Woolworths have dominated it for a long time, but they're really feeling the impact of Aldi and competitors like Aldi and Costco. So what are you seeing in terms of how those big international players are pushing into this market?
So you're absolutely right. We've really seen Aldi expand into Australia and Costco to probably to a bit of a lesser extent. And typically, if we look at some of the markets overseas where they've had a real impact, particularly in the UK, it's put a huge amount of pressure on prices. And we're starting to see that in Australia. We're starting to see people compete much more in terms of price, and I think that really what's happened is we've seen a polarisation of the market. So particularly at the lower end, lots of competition, and some of the lower end price bracket retailers have done really well. And at the top end, we've also seen sort of retailers do well. The people that are really struggling are the ones in the middle. That's where the real pressure is coming from.
So yeah, we did see that. So Woolworths so Coles had the Down Down campaign, and then Woolworths wasn't doing that, and now they've followed that too. Their idea was that consumers are much more price conscious than before. Is that just because they're seeing cheap prices elsewhere and they want them to, or is it because there is not yet confidence in the retail sector in Australia, or in the consumer sector in Australia?
I think, given the background of what we've just been through, I think low prices are very appealing to consumers at the moment. We're getting some benefits with oil prices and continued low interest rates, which is helping consumer spend, which is really positive. But the consumer wants to save money, and typically as we get more entrants into the market, we're going to get more competition, and that typically leads to lower prices, more products on offer, different customer experience. So it's really good news for us as the consumer.
So a lot more pressure though that means on the actual companies themselves. What do you predict for 2015 in terms of takeovers, for instance, or companies going out of business?
Well, I think if we look back to 2014, we've seen international players look at Australian retailers that have been struggling or where there's more value, they think. So obviously the Woolworths acquisition of David Jones, is a case in point. I think we'll probably see more interest in 2015 again. As to the companies that they may be looking at, really, it'll be interesting to see what the results are. This January and February reporting period. I think the companies that are struggling have been struggling over the medium terms in terms of growing their top line, but also in terms of trying to increase their margin or maintain their margin. They're the companies that really will be the targets.
David White, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Ed, can you just flip a second recording? Are you okay just doing a quick one on how come Aldi has shaken up the sector by so much, or how come Aldi has managed to cut prices by so much across the market? It's a separate one for another piece for another day.
Okay,
right?
Yeah, okay, ready to go.
Cool. David White, why has Aldi had such an impact on retailers around the world?
Well, Aldi has a unique operating model, very different to a lot of the other supermarket retailers. They've really rolled that out hugely successfully across Europe in particular, and starting to do that in other countries. So they are very good at sourcing. They have typically stock significantly fewer products, which gives them an advantage in terms of price and logistics, and also very good in terms of the way in which they're marketing that to consumers. So it's really offering something different that's of good quality, that's appealing to consumers because of the price, and that's really resonated certainly in the UK and Europe, and we're starting to see more of that here in Australia.
And how can they keep their prices so low? I mean, every supermarket has a home brand product. How can Aldi have theirs so much cheaper than the others?
Well, I think it's not always that much cheaper. I think there is a bit of a perception around price, but I think it's also the quality of goods and the type of goods that they stock. So they put a lot of emphasis on the type of goods that they stock that they think are going to appeal to their type of consumer. So I think that's important, but also they appeal to slightly different consumers than some of the bigger supermarkets. They do have a slightly different profile of shopper, and they're really good at focusing on that particular customer profile.
Cool. And actually, one more question. If you keep recording, Ed, it'd be great. Thanks. Are you okay if I ask you about why would Woolworths and Coles be getting involved in banking and insurance?
You ever got it? I think it's fine.
Yeah.
I think it's fine. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Why is it that companies like Coles and Woolworths are now moving away from simple groceries and going into things like banking and insurance?
Well, I think it's natural for such a large retailer to look at other forms of revenue. Everyone's looking at new products, and certainly if you look at large supermarkets overseas, that's an area that they've moved into and been very successful. So it's sort of a natural progression for the likes of Woolworths and Wesfarmers to move into other product lines. And typically there's some really good margins there, and with some of the skill set that they've got, they can certainly be very competitive. So I think it's just a natural progression that we're seeing. And
how important is the customer data that they get from rewards cards, for instance, in helping them develop those products?
What's the big advantage that they do have is they have exposure to a huge number of consumers every day, so they almost have an established customer base. So that's why it's sort of a natural evolution to move into other product lines that they can sell through to their current customers.